Morning. How you guys doing this morning? If you're new or visiting or for some other reason we haven't met before, my name's Trevor. I'm one of the staff of the church. I really hope I get the opportunity to meet you afterwards and get to know you a little bit. So I want to ask you a question. Do you remember sick days when you were a little kid? Like, I'm talking about like maybe when you were 9, sick days. I don't know about you, but for me, when I look back on these sick days, I remember them fondly, which might sound strange because, you were sick. It shouldn't be a good experience. But for me, I actually think back and I'm like, oh, those days weren't so bad, because it would always start the same, like, your mom would come in and wake you up and you'd kind of lie there for a few minutes and then, she'd come back in and you'd still be lying there and in the most pathetic voice you possibly could muster up, you'd be like, Mom, I don't feel so good, right? And you let out a little, And I'm talking, sick days when, you feel a little under the weather. I'm not talking about, like, when I had chicken pox or if was, like, violently ill and had, like, fluids coming out of every orifice. Like, that's no fun. But those days when you're just, like, a little bit under the weather, maybe you had, like, a little bit of a fever, a little cough, and, you're just down, a little fatigued or whatever. So you'd say, Mom, I don't feel so well. And then would come the test. Because, she wasn't born yesterday, so she's not going to just take your word for it. So she's going to come in and she's going to, put her hand on your forehead and make sure that, there's something that's actually going wrong here. And in that, 3.5 seconds that it takes her to get from the doorway to your bed, you're, praying that you have a fever. You're, desperate. You're thinking, hot thoughts. You're like, fire, volcanoes, surface of the sun, Megan Fox. Oh, how did that get in there? Sorry, I just used a thesaurus for things that were hot, and that showed up. She'd come and she'd put her hand on your forehead, and then she would say those magical words that every little sick kid wants to hear. You do feel a little warm. And outside, you feel like garbage because you're sick. But inside, you're doing cartwheels and there's fireworks and you're just, yeah, because you know what the rest of the day is going to entail for you. You're going to get to go back to sleep for a couple of hours. And then you're going to wake up. And then maybe you'll leave your bed to go to the couch where you're just going to curl up and your mom's going to bring you a blanket. You're going to sit and watch cartoons all day. And she's going to serve you tea and chicken soup. And your only responsibility for the entire day is to focus on yourself, to make sure that you're feeling good, to try to make yourself feel better. You're actually all of a sudden given this license to be completely self-absorbed, completely selfish, and self-indulgent. It's great. I mean, any other day, if I were to just lay on the couch all day watching cartoons and expecting my mom to come and serve me, she would, slap me upside the head and call me a spoiled, lazy, rotten kid. But this day, because I was sick, I could get away with it. Now, sick days when you're a kid, fun. Sick days when you're adult, not as fun. Turns out, you don't really get sick days when you're adult all the time. You probably have, wherever you work, you probably have some, allotted sick days or something like that, but nobody ever uses them when they're actually sick. Come on, why would you want to waste a sick day when you're actually sick? You use them when you're healthy. But even if you have sick days, there's times where you might be sick, but there's things that need to get done. You have certain responsibilities, and it doesn't matter if you're sick. It needs to get done, because if you're not doing it, it's not getting done. And if it's not getting done, you're going to be held responsible. I don't know, it sucks, actually. I miss being a kid sometimes. But these responsibilities, they need to get done. Sometimes as we go through life, we experience hard times, dark times in our lives, whether it be tragedy, loss. You lose a loved one, or you lose a job, and these things start to weigh down on you. Or maybe it's just struggles and difficulties. Maybe you're struggling to get your finances in order, struggling to find a job, struggling to find that special someone. And you've been doing this so long that it starts to weigh down on you. And with all these things, there's a tremendous amount of pain. And as the pain starts to set in, we can resort to this sick day mentality, where we want to just kind of pull aside, pull out, check out, and just be self-absorbed for a little while. We want to focus on ourselves. We want to focus on our pain, and we feel like we have the right to do so because of the pain that we're feeling. Very recently, I found myself doing this myself, and it was just kind of weighed down by some personal issues that were going on in my life, and it was mounting around me, and it caused a lot of pain. And I kind of got consumed by that pain to the point that every conversation that I had with anybody sooner or later would turn around and then become about me and what I was going through at this time. And it's actually, I probably shouldn't even say this, but I was at a funeral. I was at somebody else's funeral, and I was talking about my own problems. I mean, like, that's how bad this can be. It's embarrassing. I probably shouldn't admit that. But I was at somebody else's funeral, and I'm talking about my problems. And this is how, what's weird is that nobody even, like, called me out on it. Nobody even challenged me on it, because we almost allow for this. We accept that when people are going through hard times, when there's pain, that they're allowed to be self-absorbed and self-involved. But as followers of Christ, we can't just check out from the world when we're going through difficult times. There's work that we need to be doing, and if we're not doing it, it's not getting done. If we're checking out because we get into this funk, because we're dealing with pain, it doesn't last for a day, it lasts for weeks. Sometimes it'll last for months. Sometimes it'll go on for years, where people are just consumed by their own pain. And as followers of Christ, there's work that we need to be doing. We can't just check out and pull away. There's work that isn't getting done if you're not doing it. And you're going to be held responsible. This past week, if you've been following along in the chronological readings, we've been in the book of Ezekiel. If you have a Bible and want to open up to Ezekiel chapter 3, we're in the book of Ezekiel. And at the beginning of the book, Ezekiel is given this call from God to be a prophet. Now, when you think of an Old Testament prophet, what's the image that comes to mind for you? You probably think of this old guy with like a gnarly beard, and he's just like firmly established and stoic and out there, shouting out on behalf of the name of God or whatever. Well, this is not Ezekiel. Ezekiel is not some like old stoic guy. Actually, at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel's only 30 years old. He's a young guy. He's only a few years older than I am, a few years younger than Chris. He's like a decade younger than Robert. He's getting old. He's a young guy, and we know that he was married, and he probably had kids. They were probably young kids. He's just, a normal, average 30-year-old dude. And he's in the midst of incredibly dark times. Incredibly dark times. The whole nation of Israel, which Ezekiel is part of, has been ripped out of their land and taken into exile to Babylon. So Ezekiel's home is now being destroyed. His homeland is being destroyed. It's being occupied by this foreign enemy. He and his family and all of his countrymen and friends are being ripped out and taken to this far-off land, and he has no idea what the future holds. He has no idea if he's going to be put into forced labor. He has no idea if he's going to be able to stay connected with his family. He has no idea if he's going to be killed. His whole future is unknown. Everything is falling apart, and he has no idea what's going on. And to top it all off, there's problems at work, too. Because he's a priest, and if you've been following along, you realize that the priests have started to fall apart. They're all worshiping different gods, and there's false prophets, and there's all this tension. Everything in Ezekiel's world is coming crashing down. He's experiencing incredibly dark times, and there's a lot of pain that accompanies that. A lot of pain. And in the midst of his pain, Ezekiel is confronted by God with the reality that there's work to be done. If you look at Ezekiel 3, starting in verse 17, he says, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give warning from me. When I say to a wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not warn him or speak out to dissuade him from his evil ways in order to save his life, that wicked man will die for his sin, and I will hold you accountable for his blood. But if you do warn the wicked man and he doesn't turn from his wickedness or from his evil ways, he will die for his sin, but you yourself will be saved." Ezekiel is in the midst of these incredibly dark times. And God comes into the scene, and he seems to completely disregard the fact that Ezekiel's hurting. And he's just like, "Ezekiel, you got to get to work. Because if you aren't doing this work, I'm going to hold you accountable for what's not getting done." It's like, whoa, God, can you have a little bit of compassion here? God kind of seems like this really ruthless taskmaster at this point, like a horrible boss. Anybody see that movie, Horrible Bosses? It's kind of funny. I probably shouldn't be recommending it to anybody. But it almost seems like God is this horrible boss, like this awful tyrant who's coming in and just cracking the whip. I mean, God, can't you see he's hurting? His whole world is falling apart. Can't you find somebody else to do this work? But God comes in and he says this, and he says it so sternly. Is God just a horrible boss? Is he this ruthless taskmaster? If we press in deeper, we realize that this isn't the case, that there's more to what's going on here. In fact, even God's call, his charge to Ezekiel to get to work, is actually an act of compassion. He's trying to break Ezekiel out of the downward spiral that's causing him to be consumed by his own pain. Because as long as Ezekiel's attention is focused on his own pain, his pain will consume him. This is a very key element that we have to grasp. As long as your attention is focused on your pain will consume you. Let me say it one more time. If you're taking notes, write this down. As long as your attention is focused on your pain will consume you. And so when God steps in, it's an act of compassion. He's trying to break Ezekiel out of this because he knows that as long as his pain is at the focus of his attention, it's going to consume him. There's a study done by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Try saying that 5 times fast. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He's this renowned psychologist, and he did this really interesting study. He gave thousands of subjects these pagers, and the pagers would go off at random intervals. And whenever the pagers would go off, the subjects were told to write down what they were doing at that time and what they were thinking about. One of the really interesting findings of this study is that they found when people were doing nothing, when people were left alone with nothing to distract them, their mind would focus on themselves. And it said that their minds would naturally think about themselves, and it would come to an awareness of discontentment, a sense of inadequacy and anxiety about the future, and a chronic self-preoccupation. When people were left alone to think about nothing else, their minds would go to themselves, and it would think negative thoughts about themselves. They would think these self-deprecating thoughts. It would be this chaos. He actually says that it's like entropy, that the mind, it wants to move to chaos, but these chaotic, self-deprecating thoughts. And you can kind of see the danger that can come from this. If we're thinking about ourselves and we're thinking these negative thoughts, well, that's only going to cause pain. But if there's already pain in our lives, if we're already feeling this pain, it's going to draw our attention inward, right? When you feel the pain, you think about the pain. But when you think about the pain, you're thinking about yourself, and you're thinking these self-deprecating thoughts which make you feel worse about yourself, which only then increases your pain, which then draws your attention further inward. And it's this downward spiral that we get trapped into. And Ezekiel was in this downward spiral, and God steps in to break him out of this downward spiral so he won't be consumed by his own pain. And if we go back a few verses, we can see exactly how God does this, how he's able to break Ezekiel out of this downward spiral, to release him from being consumed by his own pain. If you go back to verse 14, it says, "The Spirit then lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness and in the anger of my spirit with the strong hand of the Lord upon me. I came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv near the Kabar River, and there, where they were living, I sat among them for 7 days, overwhelmed." That's what he says. He says, "The Spirit then lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness and in anger." Bitterness and anger, he says. I mean, tell us how you really feel. He's holding nothing back. There's this bitterness and anger. Bitterness is the outcome of this downward spiral. When we're allowed to follow this downward spiral where we're focused on our pain and we have these self-deprecating thoughts and we continue down this rabbit hole, bitterness is the end result. Bitterness is one of the most self-involved of emotions. Other emotions, even negative emotions, things like anger or hatred, they're focused on something outside of us. If you're angry at someone, or you're angry with something. If you have hatred, your hate is for something else. You hate someone else, whatever it is. But bitterness is all internal. It's something that happens at your core. The goodness starts to leave. The joy starts to leave. The sweetness in your life starts to leave, and all that's left is bitterness. And when you become bitter and all the sweetness is gone, you become useless to anybody else. Because your bitterness, it affects you and it affects everybody else around you. All they get is the bitterness because the sweetness is gone. Ezekiel is bitter. And God has to rip him out of his bitterness, rip him out of this downward spiral so he's no longer consumed by his own pain, to allow him to once again see the work, the mission that he should be on. And so what God does is he gives him a little bit of perspective. Imagine, for instance, if you were dealing with financial issues and you're struggling to pay your bills, so you had to start cutting back. And at first, you stopped going out to eat. And then you cut back a little more, and you had to let go of your vacation. And things got worse and worse, and so then you had to downgrade your home and your car and then your neighborhood, and things are getting worse and worse and worse. And then as a result, it's starting to weigh down on you and become bitter about your finances. And then God were to take you and transport you to go and spend a week sitting among AIDS-infected orphans in a third world country. You can imagine the change in perspective that would take place here. You might start off being bitter about your own circumstances, but in the end, you'll find yourself overwhelmed at the incredible need of these other people around you. And this is what we see happening with Ezekiel here. Notice how it starts off. He says that the Spirit lifted me up, took me away. I went in bitterness and anger. And then he goes to sit among the exiles for 7 days, and look at what it says. It says, there where they were living, I sat among them for 7 days, overwhelmed. There's a change in his disposition going from bitterness to overwhelmed. In a newer translation, it actually says deeply distressed, that he was deeply distressed. God takes him out of his own internal struggles, has him go sit and observe these other people to give him perspective, and he goes from being bitter to being overwhelmed. But there's something very unique about this particular case, because God doesn't take Ezekiel and take him to some foreign land. He doesn't take him to a group of people that are worse off than him. He actually takes him to his own people, to the exiles, the people that are going through the very same things that he's going through. He's not witnessing people that are worse off than him. He's witnessing his friends and his family going through the very same thing that he's going through. I mean, it would almost make sense if Ezekiel's bitterness only increased at this point, going from, woe is me to woe is us, and wondering where God is. But it doesn't. Something else is happening while he's sitting here and he's observing these people for 7 days. What is Ezekiel seeing that causes him to go from bitterness to this overwhelming distress? If you read through chapters 2 and 3 in Ezekiel, so this passage in this chapter and the chapter right before it, 12 times in these two chapters, in 36 verses, more than 12 times, God tells Ezekiel that the Israelites are a rebellious people. He says that they're either rebellious or obstinate or stubborn or some variation of that, more than a dozen times, making it very clear to Ezekiel that the Israelites, they're rejecting God. And what I believe Ezekiel is seeing when he's sitting among them for the 7 days, he's sitting there as just a fly on the wall observing them, and he's watching them rebel against God. He's watching them ignore the God who loves them, choosing their own way. He's watching them reject God, and it's breaking his heart to sit there and watch not strangers, but his own people, watching his friends and his family, the people that he loves and he cares about, rebelling against God, rejecting God. It's breaking his heart. Imagine you have a sister, a kid sister. Maybe you do have a kid sister. Imagine that this sister starts making poor decisions and starts, getting involved with the wrong sort of crowd. And as she gets deeper and deeper involved with this wrong sort of crowd, she makes worse and worse decisions. And imagine that she starts to get involved in drugs, and hardcore drugs. And then she starts to steal in order to pay for these drugs. And then takes it even farther to the point where she actually has to start selling herself in order to pay for her fix. That would break your heart, knowing this. If your kid sister was at the point in her life where she was selling herself for drugs, it would break your heart, would it not? Now imagine if you had to go and you had to watch this. You had to sit there for a week as just a fly on the wall, a silent observer watching this take place, watching your own kid sister whore herself out for drugs. Imagine the overwhelming distress that you would experience watching this. This is what Ezekiel is feeling. These are the sorts of emotions that are conjured up when Ezekiel is sitting there among his own people, the people that he loves and he cares about, and he's watching them rebel against God. This is the sort of emotions that pull him out of his own, self-centered pain, his own, consumption with his own pain, to the point where he's no longer thinking about what's going on in his life. He's thinking about what's going on in their lives. And his own pain starts to move farther and farther back in his mind, because at the forefront of his mind is the reality that people he loves and cares about are rejecting God. They're running away from God. And now his mission, his aim, is not to deal with his own pain, but to try to convince these people to come back to God. This call that he gets from God to go and speak on his behalf is no longer a burden placed on a taskmaster, but it's actually Ezekiel's own drive. His passion drives him to do this because of this experience, of the awareness of the people that he loves and cares about that are far from God. Even as I say this, for some of you in here, I expect you're starting to already connect with this. You're starting to already think about people that you know and love and care about, people that are in your life that you know are rejecting God. And as you think about that, it breaks your heart. You start to feel as Ezekiel did. You start to feel these same sort of emotions, and you're overwhelmed and distressed. But for some of you, you're not getting it. You don't see the connection. You can understand the idea of feeling overwhelming distress at the idea of your sister being a crack whore, but you don't really see the overwhelming distress about your friends and family rejecting God. In order to fully understand why these emotions are being brought out in Ezekiel as he watches his friends and family reject God, we have to go back a little farther in this passage. If you go to verse 10 in chapter 3, God gives Ezekiel a very simple command. It's a very simple command, but it's a loaded command. He said to me, "Son of man, listen carefully and take to heart all the words that I speak to you." Listen carefully and take to heart all of the words that I speak to you. Without observing this command, Ezekiel, he wouldn't feel the way he does when he becomes aware of his friends and family rebelling against God. But when he does observe this command, when we observe this command, when we listen carefully and take to heart all of the words that God has spoken to us, and then we see the people around us that are rebelling against God, it breaks our heart. It brings us to a place of overwhelming distress. And it doesn't matter what's going on in your life. It doesn't matter what sort of dark times you're in. It doesn't matter how much pain and turmoil you're under. When you see people that you love and care about rebelling against God, rejecting God, moving away from God, it breaks your heart, and your own pain moves farther in the back of your mind, and at the forefront of your mind is their need. But you need to take this command, and you need to observe all of this command. And there's three legs that this command kind of stands upon. And if you take out any of the legs, the whole thing comes toppling over, and it won't make any sense. And the first leg is, it says, listen carefully. Listen carefully and take to heart all the words that God is saying. The first part of it is listen carefully. Listen carefully. Now, I'm aware that for some of you that are here today, you aren't listening carefully to all the words that God is saying. And you're honest and upfront about that. I'm not saying it in some sort of derogatory way. It's just you don't listen carefully to all the words because you're really not sure if you buy into this whole Christian thing yet. You're not sure if this is the Word of God, and you're trying to seek these things out and understand them a little more. And if that's where you are, that's fine. And I really hope that Beacon can be a safe and comfortable place for you to explore these things further. But you also have to understand that this whole argument might not fully come together for you as far as why we feel the way we do when we see people rejecting God. At the same time, I do hope that you will be able to understand a little more why it is that we're so passionate about what we believe. So you could understand why your Christian friends are so dead set on talking about their faith so much. Why they're so relentless about sharing what they believe. It's not because they're trying to convince you of something to make themselves feel better. It's not because they're just trying to justify themselves. It's because they care about you. It's because they love you. The reality is we as Christians, we believe that if you reject Christ, you reject God. It's core to the Christian faith. And we believe that if you reject God, there's consequences, and we don't want to see people have to deal with those consequences. And so when we see people rejecting Christ and rejecting God, we want to invest in their lives. We want to change that because we care about them. We love them. In fact, if your Christian friends aren't telling you about their faith, if they aren't telling you about the gospel, then you should question their friendship. You should question how much they actually do care about you. In fact, you should go. If you have Christian friends in your life that aren't like that, don't tell you about these things, and you're not somebody who believes these things, you should go and ask them, be like, dude, do you care about me at all? Like, why have you never told me this? Because, if you cared about me, you would tell me. You should just call them when you get home, like challenge them. They'll totally take them off guard. But the reality is if we want to share this with you because we love you, we care about you, and we do believe these things. You need to listen carefully. The second leg of this command is it says you have to listen carefully and take to heart all of the words that God is speaking. For many of you, you do listen carefully. You do believe that, you do believe in the Christian faith. You do claim to be Christian. And you believe that this is the word of God even. And you listen to it, but you don't listen to all of the words. Your Christian faith is kind of more like, Burger King, where you want it your way. You want the gospel, hold the pickles, a little extra ketchup, no onions. You want to take the certain parts of the Christian message, and you want to hold on to them, but there's other parts that you don't really like so much, so you're like, I'm just going to leave them aside. And you don't listen carefully to all of the words. And so when, Jesus says that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him, well, that might be one of those things that you don't like as much. So, you just kind of push that one aside a little bit, and, you listen carefully to most of it, but not that one. And so you aren't as heartbroken when you see friends and people that you care about who aren't accepting Christ because you don't see the need for it. You aren't as convinced that there's this profound need in each of us to connect with Christ. There's this third leg as well. Maybe you do listen carefully, and maybe you do listen carefully to all of the words, and yet you still don't feel this heartbreak. You still don't feel overwhelmingly distressed when you see the people that you know and love and care about rejecting God. And maybe it's because you're listening to all the words, but you aren't taking them to heart. It's one thing to listen. It's another thing to take them to heart. I mean, for instance, I know very well that I'm a bad dancer. I also know that I should never dance in public. But I don't take this to heart, which is why at every wedding I go to, I dance my butt off, and I look ridiculous, and I don't care, because I don't actually take these words to heart. There's a difference between listening and taking to heart. We need to listen carefully and take to heart all of these words. You may know the whole message of the Bible. You might be able to recite it backwards and forwards in your sleep. You may know that humanity has disobeyed God, that we've chosen our own way, and that there's this breach in our relationship between man and God. You may know that. You may know that no matter what we do, we can never be good enough to earn our way back into God's good graces. That we can never do enough. We can never be enough to undo the wrong that we've already done. But you may also know that God wasn't satisfied with this outcome, and that God sent his own son to die for us, taking on himself the penalty for our sin, so that our relationship with God could be restored. You may know that. And you may know that all we need to do, that all we can do, is put our faith in Christ, trust in the work of Christ on the cross, and then that our relationship with God can be restored through that, and we can spend eternity with God. You may know all of those things. But if you don't take them to heart, then you won't feel what Ezekiel's feeling. Because if you do take them to heart, if you take these words to heart, then you know one day every last one of us is going to stand before God and Christ. And last one of us, we're going to be asked why we deserve to spend eternity with God. And that there's only one answer that we can give. We can only give one answer. There's only one thing that we can point to, and that is Jesus Christ and the work that he did on the cross. And you know very well that there are people that you know and you love and you care about. Now, on that day, they're not going to give that answer. People that you love deeply. That they're going to stand before God and they're going to start talking about the good things that they did and the bad things that they didn't do. And you know it's not going to be enough. And you know that God's going to turn to them and say, "Depart from me, I never knew you," and you can't be okay with that. You can't be okay with that. That has to break your heart. To the point that no matter what's going on in your life, no matter what issues you might be dealing with, all of those things go to the back of your mind, because at the forefront of your mind is the fact that people that you know and you love and you care about are rejecting God, and they're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And so you're driven away from your pain. You're no longer consumed by your pain. You're driven away from your pain, and you're driven into action. You're driven to tell these people what they're missing because you love them and you care about them. And as you do this, your awareness of your own pain begins to subside. Your pain doesn't go away. That's going to be there in this life, especially. There's going to be lots of pain, lots of turmoil. The pain's not going to go away. But your awareness of your pain does subside. It starts to diminish. This is why Paul, in 2 Corinthians, the passage that Robert read earlier, Paul, who was beaten and whipped multiple times, he was shipwrecked, he was stoned to the point where he almost died. This Paul can say, therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory. Our light and momentary troubles. Nothing was light or momentary about his troubles. And yet, in light of the eternity, he says, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes, not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. When you realize that there's people in this world, people that you love and care about, who need God, it breaks your heart and it moves you away from your pain. Your awareness of your pain subsides, and your mind is fixed on the eternal status of your friends and your family, the eternal glory that we're all going to share in. And your own pain, it becomes less and less and less important. I don't know where you are today. Maybe you're experiencing hard times. Maybe it's severe. Maybe you're in the midst of tragedy, dealing with a tremendous loss. Maybe there's just been these mounting struggles around you that have been weighing down on you to the point that you're bitter and you're in this funk. Maybe you've been there for weeks, maybe you've been there for months, maybe you've been there for years. And you're just in this funk, consumed by your own pain. I pray that today you'll become aware of the people around you that need Christ. And that awareness, that it will break your heart. It will move you out of your pain and into action. And maybe you're not in a place where you're dealing with intense pain. Maybe it's something more subtle. Maybe you just have a lot on your plate at work. And as you go through your workday, you find that every time you have a conversation with a coworker, you find yourself complaining about your job, when you could be trying to share the love of Christ with them. Because you're consumed with the work that you're doing as opposed to consumed by this reality that there are people who don't know God. Maybe, you're just busy and you're, constantly pulled in all these different directions, and your mind, whenever you have a free moment, is thinking about how busy you are and how much you need to get accomplished. And you're not making the time to reach out to people who you know and love, who need God. Wherever that you are this morning, whatever you're dealing with, whether it's severe or it's minor, please become aware of the people around you that need to hear the message of the gospel. Because if you're not telling them, who is? Paul says in his letter to the Romans this very simple truth. He says, how is anybody going to call on someone that they don't believe in? And how is anybody going to believe in someone that they haven't heard of? And how is anybody going to hear unless somebody tells them? Wherever you are this morning, may you realize that whatever your pain is, whatever you're dealing with, that it pales in comparison to the eternity that is in store for each and every one of us. May you go out with the awareness of this, the knowledge of this, and speak so that people can hear, so they can hear and believe and call on the name of Christ. Pray with me, please. God, I thank you for the ways in which you reach out to us, even in our hard times. And it might not necessarily be in the way we expect. It might not be with comforting thoughts or self-indulgence. But God, you reach out to us in exactly the way that we need to be reached. God, I pray that no matter what comes our way, no matter what struggles or pain or heartache we may have to face and endure in this world, that we will never forget that there are people around us who don't know you. People who need to know you, God. And may that awareness always be at the forefront of our mind, always. Overcoming us, overwhelming us, God, consuming us, so that we will go out and do the work that you've commissioned us to do. God, we love you and we trust you. In Jesus' name, amen.